Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit. I'm Lisa Bunnies, your host, and my guest for this session is Dr. Lotte Valentin. Our topic today is understanding how your ancestral lineage affects you physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Dr. Lotte Valentin, the intuitive physician, is an NMD, author, medical intuitive, evidential medium, ancestral healer, and an international keynote speaker. She's the author of Med School After Menopause, The Journey of My Soul, an inspirational story about transformation, healing, and spirituality, which won first place in the category of spiritual leadership in August 2021 from Living Now Book Awards. Dr. Lotte, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you have a really unique and interesting background. So let's talk about first, how did you end up on this unique path of working as a physician and an ancestral healer and a medium?
Yeah, it is a unique background. And it really started back in 1992. And just to briefly explain what happened, but it started with the fact that I had two near-death experiences. And one was in 1992 and one in 1994. And the first time I had a near-death experience and left my body was after my third child was born, and I hemorrhaged to death in the ER. Then as a result of that, I was really sick, and I had something called bone marrow suppression, where your whole immune system is suppressed and you're bruising and you get sick all the time. And then 2 years later, I experienced a second near-death experience where I left my body. And it was during that second near-death experience when I stood in the light, the unconditional love, and I met two spirit guides. And these two spirit guides showed me like a picture of the earth, but around the earth was a grid. And they told me that everything on earth is connected to each other, but everything on earth is connected up to this grid. And with that message, I pretty much got sent back. And over the next 12 years of this healing journey that I went through, I became more and more clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, and claircognizant. And I started seeing things before they happened. And I would tell my family, or I would hear things and somebody is getting sick. And I would call my relatives and say, oh, this person, you have to check on them. There's something wrong. And so all these things would start happening. And so for 12 years, the messages just got stronger and stronger. And then I was guided. The spirit world told me I had to go and become a doctor. And so I went to medical school when I was 54. And then I graduated in 2016. So this is a very condensed version of the story, just to give everybody a little bit of a background on how this all transpired. So then when I graduated in 2016, as soon as I graduated, I was guided to write that book, which I had also received as a message back in 2004 that I was to write 2 books. No, wait, 3. That was the actual message. And I have been given that message so many times. So I started writing my book, and then I was guided to go to Arthur Findlay College to study as a medium. So all this different training then somehow merged. So in 2019, so I only graduated from med school in 2016. And in 2019, now I'm working as a medium and splitting my practice, working as a physician part of the time, working as a medium part of the time. But what happened was that I would work as a medium and I would be, giving messages from the spirit world to my client in front of me. And several clients in a row would come from abusive or traumatic backgrounds. And I would see the grandmother, for example, and how she was abused by the grandfather. But then I would see the children of that marriage, which would be the client's mother. And then I would see the mother marrying the same kind of person that her own father had been. And that pattern, the exact same pattern repeated. Spiritually, I would get these messages because I see a lot of my mediumship is clairvoyant. So I see images that I then have to interpret. And I would see the same pictures would keep coming back, and it would be generation after generation. So after I had several clients, mediumship readings, I said, okay, there's something to this, because why do I have the same kind of reading with all these different people? And I was guided to study ancestral healing, or ancestral trauma, rather, or family constellation therapy, under Mark Wallin, who wrote the book, I Didn't Start With You. And so I enrolled in the training for physicians and counselors, which was absolutely fascinating in itself, because you're working with people from all over the world. And you have the lecture, and then you have to practice the tools that are being taught. And so after I graduated from that, it became this merging. It's a very unique merging. And I now understand what those original messages were back in 2004, because they told me, the spirit guides told me I had to be a doctor, but it was emerging with messages and healing. And I had to bring this to the people somehow. And it's funny how it takes so long, because when we receive messages, we have a tendency to think it's going to happen next year or 2 years from now. So now it's become this merging of my medical knowledge, my counseling training that you receive in medical school, because you have to be able to diagnose somebody correctly with a mental condition that you might have to medicate, right? So there's a lot of counseling training going through medical school. But then I also did the ancestral healing training with Mark Boleyn, which gave me a whole other set of tools. But then I've also trained shamanically with shamans. And so I integrate some of the shamanic tools sometimes in pinpointing what that ancestral trauma is coming from. And so it's become this merging of all my different backgrounds and my training. So I'm working as a physician, a counselor, a medium, and a shaman and an ancestral healer, sort of all at the same time. It's just become this merging of all those tools. But it's really fascinating. And I just love helping people this way, because many times people have had issues going on for 10 or 15 years, and there's nothing that's working. And when they tell me what they have done and the different medications they've been on, so having my medical training, I understand that, okay, we've already exhausted all those options. There's nothing there that's working. And so you know that there is another component to that, because we are spiritual creatures. We are so intertwined and interconnected with each other. And that research is just coming about now, or has been for maybe the last 10 years. And we can talk about that too.
Yeah. You've got so many tools in your toolbox. That's wow. But let's go ahead and talk about some of that research. I just find that fascinating. They've been doing research on intergenerational inheritance of behavior patterns. What have you learned?
So there is a great study that is called Epigenetic Inheritance of Ancestral Odor Fear Conditioning. I don't know if you heard about that study, but it was done back in 2013, and I think it was published in Nature Neuroscience. And it's fascinating, because I'm going to tell you how this interrelates and how this connects. But in that study, the study was led by Brian Diaz at the Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta. And what they did is they exposed mice to a smell of cherry blossom. And every time that this mouse would smell, or the different mice would smell cherry blossom, they would give them an electric shock. And so the mice was conditioned to fear the smell of cherry blossom. So now comes the interesting part. They took the sperm of the male mice that had been taught to fear the cherry blossom smell, and then they inseminated another, female mice with this sperm. Well, her offspring, her little pups, her little mice babies, exhibited the fear of the cherry blossom smell, even though their own mother had never had the experience of being conditioned to the fear of that smell. And even the grand pups exhibited fear for the cherry blossom smell. And when they looked closer, they could see that these mice had more M71 receptors. So they could detect this cherry blossom smell at a very, very low level. So they had been conditioned to fear this smell, even though they had never had the experience themselves. That transferred in the sperm that came from the grandparents, the grandparents' sperm, and it transferred down. And it's the same with humans, because as humans, we can have fears about something. And when you talk to the client and you say, well, did you experience some, this traumatic event in your childhood? No, there's no connection to that person's life. It's coming from somewhere else. And it's been inherited, just like it was passed down in the sperm of this mice. Trauma gets passed down through the generations. You may not even know what your grandparents did. So looking at, we have had a lot of wars. We had the Korean War, Vietnam War, World War II. Almost everybody has grandparents that were somehow tied to a war experience. So what did they experience? And then that got passed down. And what happens many times in families when there is a traumatic experience or events or a shameful event, something that happened, the family typically doesn't want to talk about it. So as a child, you might remember, what about grandpa? And then the family is, oh, we don't talk about him, right? And it's hushed down. And so that energetics also still lives on. And then somebody inherits that, maybe even through the DNA, and then has those experiences. So it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a perfect example for you. My grandmother was an air raid warden during World War II, where during air raid drills, they lived in the Midwest, so the chances of them actually being bombed by Germans or Japanese armies or Air Force were very slim. But they would have these drills where when the siren would go off, everybody was required to turn off all their lights, get downstairs into their basement or their bomb shelter or whatever. And my grandmother, as an air raid warden, would walk the neighborhood with her ticket book and ticket anybody who had their lights on. But in the meantime, my mom and her little brother, who were very small at the time, had to hide downstairs in the pitch black without their mom, with the air raid sirens blowing outside. And I didn't know this story until I got older, but as a child, I was terrified of, like, the tornado siren. If it was a drill, it was the same sound. Or if I'd hear, you used to watch World War II movies, if I heard the air raid siren, I would be absolutely terrified and never understood why until decades later. So that's, I think, a real world example that people can take with them. I wonder, can you share examples of people that you've worked with who experience similar responses?
Yes, it happens all the time. There are people that will have fears of an unknown fear of something. Let's say the father or the grandfather was in World War II or in the Holocaust, for example, and had fears of every time they see the men in uniform, they think this is it, right? So they are coding just like the little baby mice, right? Like the male mice that was conditioned with the electric shock. That fear of every time I see a man in uniform, this is my day, I'm going to die. And so then the grandfather survives and then has children and then grandchildren. And now the granddaughter has a fear of men in uniform and a lot of anxiety, panic attacks. But that child has never had any traumatic events, grew up in a nice family home. Nobody is working in the military or associated with the military or police or anything that has anything to do with a traumatic event. So you know that when you start digging, it came from the grandfather. So that event lives on. But events like that also repeat in different ways. So there is something I call the ancestral clock. And people will experience the same situation that, for example, their mother experienced. So, for example, somebody has a father that passed away, and the father passed away when the person's mother was, let's say, 40. But then when that client grows up and that client is 40, she goes through a divorce. And so her partner leaves her through divorce. The mother's partner left through death, but it happens at the exact same age. It's that ancestral clock. And many times you see these patterns, and people even get sick at the exact same ages with this. Even sometimes, even I've had clients getting sick with the exact same disease as their mother at the exact same age. I mean, it's fascinating because it's that ancestral clock that somehow is ticking until something gets resolved. And it is when you look at the big picture and you look at your ancestors, it is the actions of your ancestors. It is the reactions of your ancestors and the interactions of your ancestors that get passed down to you. So what they did to other people, that might be a traumatic event. If they were in a war and they killed someone, for example, as a traumatic event, right? Or if they had a trauma and then they experienced it inside of them, so they became afraid, and then they coded for that, and that got passed down. So it's the actions and reactions and interactions of the ancestors that get passed down. But then our own actions, reactions, and interactions also, we code then for our own epigenetics. So we're experiencing the same thing. But it's when you work with a client and you dissect that and figure out, well, where is it coming from? Is it coming from your dad? Is it coming from your mom? Is it coming from your grandparents? Is it coming from an uncle and aunt? It's coming from somewhere. And it can be transferred down, even people that you've never met. A stillborn baby that was born before you were born, an abortion. All these different things are traumatic events, and they get passed down. And when you think about how we evolve as humans, that our ovarian eggs that we carry, we're given all those eggs when we're only about 20 weeks as a fetus in our mother's womb. And we're already making those eggs. So you came from your mother's eggs that she made when she was a fetus in your grandmother's tummy when she was 20 weeks old. So whatever your grandmother experienced when she was 5 months pregnant with your mother is really what's coded in the eggs that you came from. See what I'm saying? So genetically, we can see that, it's transferring down just like with the sperm of the mice. But it's fascinating because we inherit these things that we don't think about. But once we can see the picture, once we can understand what it is that we're struggling with and where it's coming from, then you can create healing for that, because you're opening your mind, you're seeing it from a different perspective, and you can understand.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what you're talking about the egg that you sprung from was within your grandmother's body while she was experiencing a trauma. Well, any traumas that her grandmother experienced is within her body. So that's how it goes back more than 3 generations.
Exactly.
I'm wondering then, in your experience working with clients, how can people tell if what they're dealing with is an ancestral pattern or just bad luck with their illnesses?
I think ultimately a lot of things are ancestral in one way or another. And there's so many different factors that play a role. Is it something that we're just here to experience ourselves and it didn't come from somewhere else? And, but the only way you can really figure it out is to take a closer look at, when did your problem start? How old were you? What happened in your life when this started? Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your uncles. Tell me about your grandparents. Is there anybody else in the family that had this kind of experience? Did anybody else, get sick at a certain age? So you have to sort of play a little bit of Sherlock Holmes and see if you can find that key. But ultimately, we come from our ancestors. Even, our own previous lives are maybe we are our own ancestors, right? In a way, maybe I was my great grandmother, and then it's transferred down. I'm actually just reliving my own trauma. So it is fascinating how we can pinpoint that. So how do you know, right? So how do you know if it's ancestral or bad luck in your life? Well, you don't until you start dissecting it and see if there is a common thread that leads you somewhere else. Because we do have, traumatic events that happened, but um, even problems like financial worry, OCD, cutting, um, physical disease, mental problems, fears, it can all be related to an ancestral issue, even though we medically diagnose it and say, okay, you have OCD, here is a medication, right? But where is it coming from? And sometimes when you take a closer look, you can actually resolve that because you can see it actually it was ancestral. But you don't know until you really start dissecting the problem and speaking to the client and going down that path.
Right. So let's just say that we have discovered that we've got an ancestral pattern. What are some steps that we can take to start creating healing around those inherited issues?
Right. So depending on what it is that you're experiencing. So let's say that was a good example. Like if you're in a relationship, let's say, and you feel like you're attracting the wrong person over and over. So you're in a relationship and it didn't work out. You get into another relationship. This is a lot, something that happens to a lot of clients in there. I don't understand why I always get in these relationships. And I now have a new boyfriend or a new partner, and I feel it's the same thing that's happening. So where is that coming from? Well, there are different ways that could be happening. You could be what's called like aligning with your mother and rejecting your father. So if you, for example, had a father that was abusive, let's say, because it's such an easy example. So the father was abusive towards the mother. And so you say, okay, I don't like my father. I reject my father. And you talk to the client and they say, I don't even have a relationship with my father. But then what happens is that rejection that they have towards the father, it's an unhealed trauma. And so what happens with that is that you invite that back into your life. And now you find a partner that exhibits those exact things that you didn't like about your own father. So you're inviting that in to heal that relationship with your father through that partner. But you're also repeating the same problem or reliving the same issues that the mother had of not feeling nurtured and safe and secure. And being abused by that person, because now you're being abused just like the mother. So you have the same feelings, but you're inviting it back in order to heal your relationship with your father. But these things can also be related to a mother wound. So you have a mother wound with the mother, and through that wound, you're not being feeling safe and nurtured as a child. And then you're transposing that onto your partner. And so it doesn't matter how nice and gentle your partner is, you're never going to feel nurtured by your partner, because the problem isn't your relationship with the partner. It's the problem is originated from a mother wound, so that you were never felt nurtured by your mother when you were an infant. And that could be from, your mother was busy, she was working. You were sent away to live with the grandparents. Maybe you were sick as an infant. Maybe the mother was sick. I mean, there's so many different reasons why something like that would happen. But so it could be anything. So I'm saying it could be that is actually a problem with the mother. It could be a problem with the father. It could be a problem with the grandparents. Maybe the grandparents were the ones that had this issue. And then also your birth order within the family often plays a role in itself. And if you're a female or a male, and how many siblings you had, how many siblings your mother had, how many siblings your father had, all these different patterns play a role in typically how that pattern goes and how you align and merge and bond with different caregivers within your own family system.
Well, then let's talk about how if somebody was to work with you, how do you begin this process? How do you even get to the point where you're sussing out this information?
Right. So typically, so the client, I work a lot on Zoom with people all over the world, and they will come and they will say, I have this problem, or I have this fear, or I just don't feel, I have this problem of stepping into myself. I don't have the confidence, and I can't figure out where it's coming from, because I have good grades in school and I'm successful in my career, but I just feel like I'm not as good as other people. So then you start asking questions about, when did this start? How old were you when this feeling began? Tell me about your mom, tell me about your dad, and what are your worst fears? And tell me about your grandparents. And the language often that people use when they're just talking and just describing their mom or dad, sometimes people will say, oh, I had the best parents ever. Oh, my mom was so nice. And that was still, that can still be a problem. It just depends, because that client that you're working with, they might have the best parents in the world, and they were so cared for, but they weren't heard. They weren't seen. They were maybe upper middle class. They was in a safe home. There was no abuse. Everybody was nice and they were fed. They went to a good school. But at home, maybe this person wasn't seen, wasn't heard. No, be quiet, wipe your mouth, go to your room, and all these different rules that were imposed on them as children. So depending on the personality of that person or two, might feel really squashed, and it feels like they're sitting in a tin can with a lid on, ready to pop out. But every time as a child they try to become exuberant and happy, they would be told, oh, you're too loud. Shh, go to your room. And so they always felt squashed, and they couldn't quite, step into that power of who they truly are. So everybody has a unique background for the problem that they're experiencing. But when you're talking to the client, the words that you use to describe are typically will tell the tale or give you the sign of where it's coming from. Because subconsciously, a lot of the things that we do are subconscious. Because when you're a child and you're learning these behaviors, so let's say you were in this very nice family, you learn these behaviors as a very young child. You're going to be quiet, you're going to be neat, you don't spill, you do all these things, you help set the table, whatever it is, whatever era you grew up in. And then you become an adult, and these tapes are still playing, and so you become that the people pleaser, right? So you're learning to in order for you to gain love as a child, you do the right things. You're quiet, you're polite, you don't spill, you help, you hold the door open, you do all these different things. And then as an adult, now you're in a relationship, but you're still, that's how you were taught to receive love, for example, from your mother. So you're repeating this behavior now with your partner. And so you're the people pleaser. You're constantly trying to please other people. But what happens is that it sort of backfires, because relationships have to be a give and take, and they sort of have to meet in the middle. And it's often the person, the people pleaser person, that ruins the relationship, because they can't receive. They're unable to receive because they were taught as young children to give in order to get that pat on the back and to get that recognition. So see how it's all tied into, each person is so unique and so different of why it is they're experiencing a problem. So it takes a little bit of guidance and digging sometimes to figure out why that person has that problem. And that's why you have to go through your family tree and sort of, write out, okay, this person had this problem. What are the different events that happened? And did I pick up on those events, or is it something more, a mother wound that happened in my life with my mother? So, but mother wounds also get transferred many times. I've seen it. They have a mother wound with their mother, but their mother had a mother wound with their mother. And so it's actually just repeating it through the generations. It's fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating how interconnected we are with our ancestors, because thinking back to how I was until my first near-death experience. When I was 34, my first 34 years of life on earth was very black and white. And I did not believe in anything. The spirit world did not exist. God didn't exist. There was no afterlife. There was nothing. You die, it's black. And, if there was anybody told me anything, I would say, prove it to me. And so it's fascinating now to look at how interconnected we are and how dependent we are on our own happiness in our own life. And for us to heal physically, emotionally, and spiritually, we really have to integrate, healing the physical disease and then healing spiritually and healing emotionally, because you can't just, often you can't create healing with just one thing, right? There are stories like most people know of Anita Murjani, who had the near-death experience and she healed from her cancer, which is just a miraculous story. And of course, us scientists can't explain that. It's a miracle, but it's something to be said for that, because it's the same thing happens when you have a problem and you can pinpoint it through your ancestors and ancestral healing. And I've seen people just, get, I worked with somebody yesterday and they said it's fascinating. I spoke to her a month ago and she said it was like, bricks just fell off her shoulders, and doing healing with her own mother. And her mother is still alive. And her mother would call her and tell her, I don't know what's happening, but I'm feeling so much better. All my vitals are so much better. And it's just such a heartwarming story, because here is, my client doing the work, but it's actually affecting her living mother. And she said, and my mom has never called me. She never calls. There's a very, tough relationship there. And now all of a sudden she calls her and she tells her all these good news. And it's just a miracle. So it's fascinating, because it shows us how interconnected we are. And when we do that work, energetic work, and we have these aha moments ourselves, then all of a sudden we can create healing, just like Anita Murjani miraculously healed from her cancer, and many other people like her. It is that aha moment. Once you see it, you can heal it, but you have to awaken that. So it's like when you see these young children when they get hearing aids, you see on Facebook, or the first time they see their glasses, and all of a sudden the whole world, like, they're seeing it for the first time. And it's that kind of an experience that when you're doing ancestral healing, once you see it, is, oh my gosh, there it is. I've had this fear my whole life, and now I know where it's coming from, and it's not even mine. And it just goes away, right? It's just miraculous. So.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing those stories. Those are wonderful, wonderful illustrations of what we're talking about here. I'm wondering, do you notice in working with people that certain illnesses, diseases, whatever you want to call them, physical malfunctions, do they seem to correspond, like a specific illness correspond with a specific issue, or does there seem to be no rhyme or reason?
There are studies that show that. Gabor Mate, who is a psychotherapist, has written a lot about that. And I think his book is called When Your Body Says No, or something like that. And they did studies. In that book, there's a lot of studies where it shows that certain people tend to get certain diseases. So certain people tend to get breast cancer, certain people tend to get ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And what's fascinating is that we tend to say, I've had many patients tell me, if I could just tell my aunt, and she has breast cancer or liver cancer or whatever, but she's such a negative person, and I know she gave it to herself. And there is truth to that, right? But there is also, we shouldn't blame ourselves for the things that we experience, because it's subconscious, even if it did happen that way. But it can also be maybe we incarnated to have this experience. And I always remind people that babies are born with tumors. They did not sit in the womb and have negative thoughts about life that they were going to experience and then gave themselves a tumor. So things do happen, and it can be environmentally, you have an environmental exposure that gave you the tumor, But it is true that our thought patterns do affect us. And Bruce Lipton, for example, did research where he grew cells in different petri dishes. And depending on the environment that the cells were in, he would grow bone cells, bone or fat or muscle cells in the different petri dishes, depending on the environment. And so when you put it together and you say, okay, my grandfather had a traumatic experience, so he changed his epigenetics, and now he flipped on these genetic markers, and they've seen that in the like FKBP5 gene. They've seen that trauma also passes down, not just in mice, but also in humans. And so then he flips that genetic marker. But then where was we going with this? The lost my train of thought. What I was gonna tell you. So the genetic markers that the grandfather flips on, gets passed down to you through the different generations. So yeah, it's fascinating.
It is absolutely indeed. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Before we go any further, though, I want to make sure that I mention your website if anybody wants to get in touch with you. You've actually got two. One is drlotte.com, and the other is divinespiritualessence.com. What's the difference between the two sites?
So drlotte.com is more my medical website, and my number to my clinic is on there. But it also has other things that I do and interviews that I've done and things like that are listed on that. But if people want to work with me spiritually for ancestral healing or medical intuitive, then they go to divinespiritualessence.com, and that is where they can book a session with me. So I do work a lot as a medical intuitive as well, because I would hear the spirit world tell me that the client has, a certain problem. And then you run that extra test, and sure enough, there it is. Even though there's no medical reason for running that test, because they check out just fine. But then the spirit world would say, "Oh, you got to run this one test because they have this," and then sure enough, they do. So it's fascinating. But Divine Spiritual Essence is for my spiritual work, for scheduling sessions, and then Dr. Lotte is more the clinic. Perfect. But they're connected. You can go to either and connect over. So.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time here. I want to make sure that before we go, is there anything that maybe I've forgotten to ask, or that you still have bouncing around in your head that you want to make sure we talk about before we go?
Yes. So the train of thought that I just lost was about people who I have so many things I want to share that it's hard to keep it all straight. But how people sometimes, tell me that, oh, my aunt is so negative, she gets that cancer. Right. So Bruce Lipton proved that. But it does play a role, but we can't blame ourselves for anything that we do. And that's the point I'm trying to make is don't blame yourselves for what you are experiencing, because it's part of your journey in this life. And it's basically just a journey. And we're here to resolve our problems and move forward in life. And there's so many different components that are part of our human experience. But don't blame yourself, and don't blame your relatives for the different things that they have or are experiencing. They are on their own journey, and you are on your own journey. And you basically just have to worry about your own journey and how you fit in. So.
Beautifully stated, and thank you so much, because we don't want to victim blame here. It's not helpful at all. And if you are the kind of person who blames yourself, it might be something that you've inherited from your family as a pattern. Blaming ourselves is what we do. So, thank you for making that clear. Wow, thank you again, Dr. Lotte. This has really been a fascinating conversation. I've so appreciated you being with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to remind everyone I've been talking with Dr. Lotte Valentin, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.